The Scott Ransom might just be the most integrated enduro mountain bike on the market, but what does that integration mean once you get it out onto some rough and rowdy trails? Stay tuned to find out in this review on loamwolf.com. Let's go. Oh, it's so bad. Yes, this is the Scott Ransom in the 900 RC, their top spec, and it's a bike that had a lot of following up to do from the previous generation Ransom, which actually won our Bike of the Year award many years ago. For the new generation, Scott has moved to their integrated suspension technology design, with the rear shock hidden within the down tube, still providing 170mm of rear travel, which is paired to a 170mm fork and a pair of 29-inch wheels as standard, although there is the ability to convert to a mixed wheel setup with a 27.5-inch flip ship in the rear end. With the integrated suspension technology on the Ransom, rather than using the 4-bar design that they had on the Genius and the Spark, instead they've moved to a 6-link kinematic, so it's a 6-bar design, giving them a little bit more engineering freedom and possibilities to tune the kinematics exactly to how they like, as well as to obtain the packaging and the travel from this bike in the way that they desired. The integrated suspension obviously gives a very unique, futuristic look, and with the rear shock integrated in there, with the handlebars, with the headset cable routing, the TracLoc system, this is all a very futuristic bike. But does it perform well? You'll have to stay tuned for the ride impressions as we get onto that a little bit later in the video. We're just going to keep it pretty simple for the overall tech specs and everything on the Ransom. If you do want to learn more, head to the website in the description below, where there'll be a full write-up of the bike. This is, like I mentioned, 170mm travel on both ends. It's a hardcore enduro bike. It's got an adjustable headset cup that lets you tailor the headset between a 63.8 and around about 65 degrees, also with a middle setting in between. The geometry overall is fairly middle of the road, I'd say, for an enduro bike. Fairly steep seat tube angle, 440mm fixed rear end across the size range, that 63.8 degree head angle that I mentioned, and reach numbers that are fairly typical of the enduro mountain bike space right now. I opted to test a size large. It was a spot-on fit for me at 6'2" with a slightly shorter torso than average. And yeah, there's really nothing offensive in the geometry of this bike. Nor is there that much offensive in the kinematics of that rear end. Although it does have the 6-link design, none of the kinematics are particularly stand out, for better and for worse. You know, with the extra complexity, the extra linkages, the extra hardware that comes with the 6-link design, you might be expecting there to be something super special in the performance of the rear end, but there's not really. It does have around about 28% progression. There's scaling anti-squat that increases as you get into smaller cogs in the cassette, meaning you get more support as you're putting in more rider energy, say in a sprint, compared to in the climbing gears, where you get a little bit more comfort and traction out of the rear end. But still, it's certainly a supported bike with all the percentages of the anti-squat at over 110% in the sag range. Their anti-rise is 60 to 70% depending on where you are in the travel, which is fairly typical of a horse-link design these days, really. What you do find though on the bar to make things slightly special is the TracLoc system. Of course, being a Scott bike, this does have a remote lockout up on the handlebar. This gives you 3 positions. It gives you a climb mode, an open mode or a descend mode, and it gives you a ramp control mode, the middle setting. That closes off a chamber in the special Fox Flotex Nude shock, which increases the overall ramp up of the rear end and increases the progression, giving you a little bit more of a platform to push off and giving a bit more support, just to make it better suited to more flowy terrain. Then you get the climb mode for giving you maximum efficiency for pedaling, and then you've got the descend mode that lets you keep everything open and makes it nice and smooth for the rougher and rowdier terrain. There's a couple of neat details that Scott's included. It does have internal frame storage up in the down tube, and then there's a hatch on the bottom of the down tube that lets you pop off and get easy access to the rear shock. So although it looks like you won't be able to adjust anything, the reality is you can actually get to most of the dials on the shock easier than on comparable frame designs with the shock hidden within a set of linkages. To make sag setup easy, there's a sag indicator or a travel indicator around the bottom bracket area on the outside of the frame. Then you get niceties like plenty of room inside the front triangle for a bottle cage. There's a little tool integrated into that down tube cover, meaning you've got access to tools on the fly. And generally everything's been pretty damn well executed, as you'd expect from Scott's engineering team. Scott recently updated the build kits available in the UK and Europe with new spec levels that are both up-to-date specs with newer components that are fresh to the market and lower price tags, which is really awesome to see. In North America at the moment, it's currently still the old models that are showing, so the proposed value is slightly worse, but there might be some deals available to clear them out from your local dealers, so do be sure to check that out if this is still a bike that's interested to you. We tested the model year 24, 25, I guess, 900 RC, the top spec. This retails for $9,999, while comparatively the new model year 25, 26 with a Fox podium on it and SRAM Mavens instead of the codes fitted to this comes in at €7,600. If you want to check out all the specs of this 900 RC that you can't see, then head to that website in the description below. But for now, let's get right into the ride impressions and talk about how the Scott Ransom 900 RC performed.
Woo. Yeah, this one.
I took my time reviewing this one as there was a lot of different things that I really wanted to put it through to ensure its durability and to really get to the bottom of its performance. The Scott Ransom has been an absolute blast to test. It's really a bike that spoke to me a lot in its design, its philosophy, and the possibilities that that TracLoc system offer, much like the Canyon Strive, where the bar-mounted shapeshifter on that bike would let you quickly transform the character of the bike and means that you can select a more descending focused setup and not have to compromise to bring in some more efficiency for slightly mellower terrain. The TracLoc system on the Scott Ransom lets you do exactly that. That ramp control just gives you a little bit more support for more pumpy kind of bike park but flow trail style terrain. And then the climb switch really brings in a huge amount of efficiency, meaning that you can hammer on the pedals for hard sprint efforts or just get a little bit more efficiency out of the bike for the way up the hill. That's not to say that this bike needs it though. The climbing performance is impressive. The kinematic is dialed for general pedaling efficiency as it is. The TracLoc only extends to increase that further, taking this from a good climbing enduro bike when you're not using it to a very, very good climbing enduro bike, if not a good climbing bike in general when you're using that TracLoc. But because of that TracLoc system, it means that you can change the setup of the bike a little bit to really get the most out of the rear end. So I found myself on days where I'm going to be riding a lot of extended rough and rowdy descents, I'd end up setting up the rear end to having 37% sag on the sag indicator, which ends up being a bit more like 32 or 33% on the shock shaft because of how leverage ratios work. With that heavily sagged setup, you got a lot of compliance, a lot of comfort out the rear end, and a really nice integrated feeling deep into the bike. But then for the times that the trail turned a little bit mellower, you're able just to flick it into the middle setting, the ramp control setting of the TracLoc, and get a little bit more support out of the bike so it wasn't just wallowing around everywhere. The climbing position is solid. It's not the most bolt upright bike out there on the market, but I'd say the seat tube angle when you've got the saddle pushed forward slightly in the rails is a nice comfortable spot to be in. And because you have the functionality to choose between a little bit more compliance and an easily accessible lockout switch, this is a machine that goes up just as well as you'd expect a Scott mountain bike to. Talking about descending performance, and the Scott Ransom does descend incredibly well once you've got it dialed in and the setup right. The geometry for the way down the hill is dialed. I wouldn't say it's the most balanced. It does have a slightly more rearward weight bias than many, and that's only going to be exacerbated further in the extra large size. But it's definitely not a bike that makes you feel unconfident. It still gives you plenty of weight on the front wheel to keep it charging. You get a nice response. It feels light and taut overall. The rear end, even though it's got just a Fox Float X nude shock, not a X2, for which you might be expecting to find on a more aggressive bike like this, it does just still feel very nicely controlled. It's really nice and supple off the top. It gives you plenty of support towards the end of the travel. And it just lets you really charge. The kinematics are nicely selected. There's nothing quirky going on in the leverage ratio curves or anything like that. It performs well when you're heavy on the brakes. And in general, Scott has nailed the kinematics of this bike. The overall feeling is fairly stiff. I think the frame is fairly rigid as it is, but they've given it quite a compliant wheel set. This Raceface Turbine R wheel set is a little bit on the flexy and compliant side. The spokes are straight pull and unbraced. They don't actually touch each other, which means that the wheels have a certain resonance and a certain twang to them, which I didn't find myself loving. So I did end up swapping these wheels out for a while just to see how they'd feel with a slightly burlier feeling wheel set. And I did prefer the overall more stout feeling of another wheel set on this bike. But for a rider looking for a little bit more compliance and comfort, these Turbine Rs are a stellar wheel set, and they held up really well as well when I was pushing them hard. There were a couple of times that I found myself wondering if they could have given it a couple of more details just to push its performance even further. The first one being the chainstay length. The fixed 440mm chainstay length across the size range, or even down to 432mm if you have it in the 27.5-inch rear wheel setting, may be a little bit on the short side for the current crop of people who are extending their rear ends further and further to try to get a little bit more of a centered, integrated feeling in between the wheels. And it would have been really great to see Scott implement the adjustable chainstay length that they've given the new Gambler on the Ransom 2, just to let riders select and optimize the handling of the bike to the terrain on the menu of the day. It's also disappointing for a $10,000 non-electric mountain bike to not see scaling chainstay lengths to retain the same balance across the size range. That is a premium feature that's really good to see, even if it's up for debate whether it is necessary, but yeah, it's still, when you're spending that much money on a bike, you'd love to know that Scott's put every single bit of effort into tuning the overall handling characteristics for every height of rider, not just selecting a single chainstay length and calling it good. The other thing that would be cool to see is a bottom bracket height adjustment. I guess with the complexity of the 6-link, implementing this would have just further added to the complexity and the amount of hardware needed on this frame. So there's potentially just a balance to create there. But I would have loved to see that just as another tuning parameter. Of course, you've got the adjustable headset cups. I didn't find myself wanting to go any steeper than the 63.8-degree nominal headset in the slackest position on the Ransom. As such, I haven't played about with that system. I have changed out the bar and stem though, because the integrated Syncross Hicks and IC cockpit is a little bit on the stiff side, and because it's integrated bar and stem, you don't get the bar roll adjustment, and I find myself just liking the bars rolled a little bit further back than average, I guess. So I wasn't able to get myself feeling fully comfortable with that integrated carbon bar and stem. So I swapped it out. Scott sent me a Syncross stem that I was able to fit with a set of Bergtech ride-wide bars that I had lying around, so I was able to get a more comfortable feeling in the cockpit and a slightly more compliant feeling as well. And things improved overall with the comfort in the front end for me. Of course, you do get a beautifully futuristic looking cockpit with that integrated bar and stem, so there's definitely merit to it for the right kind of rider, and if it fits you and you like the slightly stiffer but super lightweight feel, then that's great, but it just wasn't for me. I would have loved to experiment with a 27.5-inch rear wheel in the Ransom, but unfortunately my frame did have a slight manufacturing defect which didn't let that flip chip turn into the 27.5-inch position. But that said, because the chainstays get shorter, quite considerably shorter, down to 432mm when you fit in that 27.5-inch rear wheel, it does mean you're going to be left with a very rearward bias on the bike, so it's probably going to be reserved only for riders looking for a very much playful and bike park focused machine. I would have loved to see the ability, like I said, to extend the chainstay length, especially when you're fitting the 27.5-inch rear wheel, to retain the balance a little bit and give you that little bit more confidence when you're pushing it hard on rough and rowdy descents. But for riders looking for a more playful overall rig, the 27.5-inch wheel setting is definitely going to give you that, and it's cool to see the adjustability still being given with that complicated 6-link design. Throughout testing, I didn't have any issues with this bike in terms of durability or longevity. The hardware all stayed really tight. There was no creaking, there was no extra flex or anything really. The headset cable routing isn't going to be for everyone. There's a lot of hate against it. I understand why. It does add a little bit more complexity to simple service items, and the typical integrated headsets aren't as well sealed as a standard headset unit would be. But the bike's been washed countless times, left wet, and the headset's still spinning smoothly and hasn't provided any creaks or anything. So I don't think it's as big of a problem as some people might be making out, but it is going to add that little bit of complexity, which means that it might not be for you. So do consider if you're going to be able to deal with that, or if you'd rather go for something with a standard headset. But in the end, I think this bike is pretty special. The integration I do love. People will say it looks like an e-bike, unfortunately, if you own this bike, which does kill you a little bit when you've been putting in a hard pedaling effort and enjoying the efficiency that the Ransom provides. but the integration, the dialed handling, the really well engineered generally aspect of this frame, everything's been really well thought out. It is good to work on and it stays together really nice and tight, and most importantly rides really well. Are going to make it a good bike for the kind of rider who finds value in all of those aspects. Price-wise, in America, with this build, $10,000, I can't say it's good value. But there are probably going to be deals available, and as we see the model year 25-26 builds coming in, the value proposition has improved significantly. Especially that top tier build now coming in at €7,500 does seem a lot more reasonable. Still a good chunk of money, of course, but with the top spec components that come on it, it definitely helps to take the sting off of this $10,000 build. But the cheaper builds do start to bring the price down considerably. Unfortunately, they do come with a slightly heavier frame, they do come with worse grade components, and the value proposition still isn't going to match the absolute best of them out there. But even with those cheaper builds, you do still get all of the functionality of the more expensive bike. So the value proposition definitely does benefit the slightly cheaper end of the spectrum on these bikes, and the model year 25-26 cheaper builds especially do look pretty damn dialed. A huge thanks to Scott for the patience and supplying us with the Scott Ransom to test. It's been an absolute blast. Huge thanks to Darko also for being the channel sponsor at the moment and providing us with a bunch of fantastic gear to ride in. And thank you to you guys for watching this review, and especially to our members for helping to support the Loam Wolf. Do go hit our members area, hit our store, pick up some Loam Wolf merch, and hit the subscribe button so you don't miss out more awesome content and awesome bikes like the Scott Ransom 900 RC. Thank you so much for watching. Catch you out on the trails.